Hi, my name is Marcus, and this is a companion podcast for the CG Jung Helpdesk meetup group. I host live events on Zoom every 2 weeks about the concepts and ideas of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Every event, I give a presentation about the Jungian concept, so have fun with this event's topic.
Recording in progress, that's perfect. And I want to welcome you to a special topic of what makes an idea Jungian. And my idea behind the event and the topic was really, I did this movie analysis before for 4 movies, Barbie, Fight Club, Titanic, and Jaws. And the basic question for many people were, okay, yeah, why this movie or that movie, or why not this movie or that movie? And I said, okay, yeah, this is very good example to explain certain concepts of Jung, even multiple ones, so that they're stacked on top of each other. And then, of course, it comes to the question, yeah, okay, what about this movie? Is it Jungian about this movie, this movie? And for me, it did not feel right because I tried to see certain things. And back then, I was not really aware of the things that I tried to see. I knew what they would show as an example for a concept, but to see that they are just certain red threads and basic premises that Jung works with, and that they then combine to certain things on a higher level than it's like the movie Jaws, then it's below the hero journey with a shark that represents unconscious forces that need to be engaged in a disagreeable manner to transform the person into a higher consciousness. And of course, you move then lower and you hit some bedrock at the certain point where it's as long as something confirms to this idea or this premise Jung is interested in and Jung talks about. This is why I wanted to explore these pillars that are at the basis, where as soon as you hit a certain thing, Jung is automatically interested in. And it does not really matter the topic. It can be anything, but if it confirms to a certain criteria, he really seems to be interested and into it and talk about it. And the very first thing I want to talk about, which is a staple of Jungian psychology, and he mentions so often and is integral. And if you get this down, you can understand really huge source of his ideas. And this is about the idea of opposites. That you have two incompatible things that kind of exist on a spectrum, but they're at the opposite end of the spectrum, working against each other. And we had this so often that he separates things into opposites, like male, female, consciousness, unconsciousness, also the mind and the body. And even when you have these psychological functions of thinking, feeling, intuition, sensation, he also has to put them into opposites. He has to put everything into opposites. And the reason for that is that for him, it's incredibly attractive. He says, as soon as you have an opposite, it is a certain tension happening there. Same as when you have a man and a woman there is potential tension between them. Or you have the consciousness and unconscious. Those are two things that are exclusive in a sense. They are very different, but they complement each other. So there are certain facets of a whole, but distinguished facets. And they seem so incompatible that there has to be tension between them. And for him, the opposites always mean movement and always tension, energy, same as you have in electricity. You have a positive pole and you have a negative pole, and between them, the electrons are going. If the loads are the same, nothing changes. So you need to have this difference for things to move. Same as why does something roll down or fall down? Because it's gravity. It's changing the state where it is. Like Newton sitting on the tree, the apple is on the tree and falls down to the ground. There's the opposite. There's tension. You have above and you have below. And for Jung, this explains a lot of things, why and how they're happening. And he says this movement between is really what interests him. Like, how does one thing move to another state and what's happening in between? And this is why he often talks about compensation. Because when you have one thing, when you're only masculine, you're missing the feminine part. So this one will come just automatically by itself because you always need both parts. The opposites can't be exclusive. You can't only have one part, but they have to be taken into account both at the same time. And he even says that about the end point of individuation or really knowledge or truth, that at a certain time, it becomes paradoxical because both things are true at the same time. It's very easy to say, oh, there's only one thing and you only have to take care of one thing. This is easy. But he says you have to take into account the other thing. And even though that they negate each other or disagreeable, they're together true. And to hold this tension and being able to withhold this tension is a sign of being on a really developed consciousness and just be very individuated. So for him, it's about always recognizing those opposites, but also bringing a balance to them. As soon as one thing is too much, then the other thing will come. He says, as for example, for the function, when you're too much on the thinking side, you have to develop your feeling side, or rather, even your feeling side can become automatic and force it itself onto you. So he says the basic function of the psyche is that you have opposites and that they have to engage with each other. So you have an opposite, but you might not necessarily recognize it. And this is another thing that he talks about very often. That explains a lot about why he is interested in certain things. He really looks into the common, the benign, the daily, the disagreeable things, or let's say even fringe stuff, because he says there's always value there. As soon as people label it in a certain way that's charged with feelings, so with value, with a value judgment, for example, I like something or I don't like something. Again, there's an opposite. There's a reason why something screams out, or I don't like it, or this is uncomfortable, or I don't want to do it. Because he says there's a million things outside that you could encounter and that could happen to you. But certain things just speak out, of course, that you like them or that you don't like them. And very often people tend to do the things that they like and ignore the things that they do not like. But again, we're at the point of opposites and compensation. Looking in the things that you do not like, that are dark, that are painful, at the same way, the way of development, because it's bringing in the opposite. So this development through the shadow is through a pretty disagreeable part, through a hard part, because it's the negative of one's personality, of one's views, of one's actions. But still, one has to go through this very dark valley. This was the explanation for Jung why not everybody is enlightened. When enlightenment is such a good thing, it's better to be enlightened than not to be enlightened. Then why is not everybody enlightened? And it's because you have to go this very hard way, this very disagreeable way. And this is a process for him of transformation, that you change. And you change by seeking out the opposite, or the opposite being enforced to you, and changing how you do things. And now is the very interesting part. His later part in life, he was interested in alchemy. And alchemy is all about that transformation, the transformation of a base metal like lead into gold. So from something very common, very ordinary, very normal into something that is special and has very high value. And he says it's already in there, it's already in the lead, but it needs to be transformed and brought out through certain processes. And he was interested in alchemy because he saw there a matching on psychological processes that are happening internally. So he said what the alchemists were seeing in the material world was really what was happening inside of them. Again, as a staple of the psychology, so just how it works. We change and transform in our psyche and our psychology from something that may seem from the beginning very ordinary to something which is incredibly valuable in the end. And this is why he was incredibly open to everything that exists outside. I mentioned alchemy, but he was also interested in spirituality, the occult, astrology, all these things, because he says, oh, it looks fringe like this. Many people do not take Jung seriously because he took those things seriously, because he says, oh, people are talking about it. They're having this value judgment. They have this feeling about the things that there is something, whether they like it a lot, like when people are interested in astrology, they're very interested in astrology, or people don't like astrology. That's an example, or alchemy, or the occult, or spirituality, or religion. All these things. That's very often it's hard there to be completely neutral, especially when people are talking about it for hundreds of thousands of years. He's saying, oh, there has to be something there. And this is why he was looking everywhere, because he saw value everywhere. He said, okay, there's something in there that tells us something about ourselves, about our psyche, something that can be unpacked, transformed into something that provides value and can transform the psyche and consciousness of the person that's encountering this. So this is not really random. There's a reason behind it. And this is another staple of Jungian psychology, and his basic premises is this idea of unconscious. And unconscious means just not knowing or not being aware. To say, your field of view that you have in the world, it's limited. You only know a limited part. And it might seem that what you can perceive and do and know is everything there is. That's the whole world. But this is not true. There's everything around it happening. And for him, that's all unconscious. It doesn't matter whether it's internal, external, if it's personal, unpersonal, again, opposites. It's unconscious always to a degree. And when you encounter something, it is first unconscious. You have to think about it like a present. When it's Christmas time or your birthday, you get a present. What's in there is unconscious for you. For the other person, it's conscious, but for you, it's unconscious. So it could be basically everything at that point, up to the moment when you open it up and then see what's really it is. And this is then also what the unconscious does, just flooding it with potential suggestions. So this idea of unconscious, of even not being able to see and perceive, that even perception is like a muscle that you need to train to be able to perceive something. For example, whether your partner is angry or not, or whether you're going to make a sale when you're a salesman. So in the beginning, when you start out, same with the very first relationship or the very first date, it's highly stressful and you don't know what's happening, what's working and not. And with time, you become more proficient. And it's not only the skill, it's also perception for Jung, that you're able to perceive certain things based how your consciousness is construed, what's integrated, like how developed it is. And he says, it's not only between knowing and not knowing, there's a big valley between, and this is just misunderstanding. You might think you understand something, you might think that you perceive something, but that is not necessarily true. So there could be huge misunderstanding, which causes value to be hidden. So let's talk about astrology or alchemy. A lot of people see it, but they see not really what is potentially there. Jung saw the potential, but other people saw, okay, they try to make gold. It's stupid. That does not work according to chemistry, which is true. Or astrology is saying, oh yeah, how are the planets supposed to change our moods here on Earth? That's stupid. Why engage with it? But this misunderstanding, not knowing, not seeing, Jung spent a lot of time with it, especially in his practice as a therapist, when he has patients that they had blind spots in their life. There were certain things that they did not spend their time with, that they did not content with, and making them aware of the things that they're leaving out. Again, this idea of there's a small part, but you have to take into account the bigger part. You have to take into account everything. It was Jung's job to enlarge this field of vision, to be able to perceive and know more things, especially everything related to the person, that they can live their normal life. So this is also where symbols come in. When you dream of something, that you see it, but you do not necessarily understand it. You might have the feeling that you understand it, but very likely it's something that is just right outside your reach. It's kind of your unconscious pushing something toward you that you're not able yet to perceive, but looks like something you can perceive. It's in this between state again, between two opposites of being conscious and unconscious. There's a symbol in the middle to act like a guide to get somewhere. But the immediate feeling is likely wrong. And Jung said that about his own dreams. He said he has no idea what this means because it's always outside of his consciousness. So I mentioned now already a lot of things. And this is, again, a typical Jungian thing. For him, everything is connected. For him, it's completely fine to switch between his patients who have a neurosis, for example, switch to alchemy, switch to religion, switch to how primitive psychology works. For him, it's all logical and it's all connected. And if you know where he's coming from, there is a logical connection to everything. And the reason for him is that there are patterns everywhere. So Jung really saw patterns. And that's also how he calls archetypes. He calls it patterns of behavior. This is just behavior that follows certain rules, certain logics. One might not be aware of that. One might misunderstand that, but there is something that can be uncovered as a basic function of reality or the psyche that can be explored and described as a pattern, something that repeats itself, not only in one person, but in many persons. And not only in one culture, but many cultures in the past and in the present, and it will also do in the future. And for him, it means there are not really coincidences. Jung never talks about coincidences. He says everything is connected. When you have a dream, this dream is purely subjective and a representation of your psyche and your psychological state of that moment, even. So you dream of a fairy, there's a reason why you are dreaming of a fairy. For Freud, this was random. He said, okay, yeah, it's actually about the mother, but your censor does not want to upset you. This is why it's a fairy. Or no, the explanation is more, this is why it's not your mother, but something else. And Jung never was satisfied with, it's just something else, but rather, oh, it's a fairy. It has to have a meaning why this patient is dreaming of a fairy. It's all connected. And he even goes so far with your perception being connected to you, with the idea of projection, that you perceive the things that you're missing in your psyche that are being pushed to you and that you're living out of your small field of view. And he gets even farther, and that goes into synchronicity. So weird events happening around you that have meaning for you personally. So he says in this synchronicity that in the outside world, things are happening according to your own psychological needs that can be then uncovered. That, of course, first need to be perceived, then likely are misunderstood, and then can be integrated into the psyche. So, yeah, everything is connected as above, as below. And the reason why he sees these patterns everywhere and why he can connect these things and have this great openness about really a vast array of topics is because for him, in its core, it's psychology. And this is how he approaches these things. So he does not approach alchemy as alchemy or Kundalini yoga as Kundalini yoga, but he says, well, actually, it's psychology happening there in the background. And this is what gives us insight into psychology, but also that explains why human beings came up with it and why we're still interested in it, because it confirms to certain psychological needs. Also, culture or religion, he explains all these things through a psychological lens. And this is even what he says. He said, is our psyche perceiving and everything is filtered through it, our consciousness, of course, but also our psyche in general, which causes this weird phenomena that the psyche is exploring itself and trying to explain itself, which of course is then incredibly hard. And this is one of the reasons why he sees blind spots for people and these misunderstandings. And especially then in regard to psychology, that it's very hard that you're trying to measure the instrument you're measuring with. So of course this can throw way off the measurements. And this is for him also the reason why we're so interested in psychology today, because the old understanding of these things, for example, religion, is lost to us. It's a little bit gone. It looks a little bit common now. But he says, oh, there's value that can be unpacked. This can be very useful for people to know and to understand. And if you talk about opposites, and I will continue talking about opposites, another big one he's talking about is the individual. So the most personal thing that can there be, which is you, with your individual life, your individual experience, and your individual journey. And then there's these incredibly vast universal things. And he says both of them are true at the same time. Both of them are happening in you at the same time. You have your consciousness with your ego, which is your life story, everything that you know. But then you have this universal part as a collective unconscious in human nature that you also have in you. And both need to work together and both have to be taken into account. You can't be only collective universal. You have to have your individual life. But at the same time, you can't only have your individual life. You also have to take care of all the universal stuff happening in your psyche, in the collective unconscious. So subjective, as I said, is perception and the seeing and understanding. This is completely subjective. This is your state of consciousness, not even exclusively to you as a complete human being, but rather your stage, how you are at this moment. So your consciousness will be different in a year or 5 or 10 or 20 years. And this will then again also have an influence on your perception. There's a constant change happening there. So even though it's subjective, it's changing constantly, and it's changing at these universal patterns. For example, he says, for man, this recognition of the anima, so the female part in their psychology, goes through a transformation, which is following the same pattern again, where it's first the mother, because one has contact with one's own mother, then it's a prostitute, and so on and so on. So while the journey is individual for oneself, zoomed out, then again, it's universal pattern that is happening, and it's just part of the journey. Same as individuation. He says individuation is about becoming an individual and separating oneself from other forces. But at the same time, even though that's completely individual, and he says you need to live your individual life, it's a universal pattern to do so. Both things at the same time, a kind of paradox. It's collective, but at the same time, it's not. And yeah, this, I mentioned it already multiple times, with like things happening in the psyche and something is being pushed towards you. And this idea of autonomous forces that have their own idea and their own agenda and their own worldview, this is a very big staple of Jung. And this is, I guess, why he was also so interested in psychoanalysis, because Freud said, you're not the lord in your own house. You think you have your apartment, you know all the rooms, you all know all the furniture because you bought it. But at the same time, you're not alone. There's things happening without your conscious control, even without you knowing or with you misunderstanding it, which causes things like gremlins, let's say, or ghosts in the apartment. And this is what he would constantly tell his patients, that not everything happening in their psyche is necessarily their fault. It's just some natural process taking place. And one should be careful not to identify with that and saying, oh yeah, this idea, this thought, this feeling, this emotion, this is actually me and this is what I really want. But rather, oh, okay, this can be a process happening in the background from the psyche trying to compensate for something which is being misunderstood by you. So this is complicated again to understand if you don't have the consciousness to really perceive or process that. This is why he talks about psychology, and this is why he talks about all these things, that people are able to perceive that and be aware of things that are happening in their psyche, that they are not the reason for them happening or not even wanting them to happen. You can kind of force it by being too one-sided, to be onto one side of the opposite too much, then the other one will come by necessity. But at the same time, not everything that happens to you, even though that's subjective, even though you have synchronicities, is necessarily your fault. Some things just happen. And this is also what he then again had to teach his patients, is again always between these poles, between hyper subjective and individual and then completely impersonal universal. To say like, yeah, that you dream of these things or these things are happening, they are related to you because you did not do certain things. But at the same time, not everything happening to you is your fault. You should not try to find yourself in everything. Like, if the world is big, not everything is because of you. And then switching between these opposites and trying this middle ground, this is, he says, this is a golden path. But being able to perceive both and to act according to both, this is really the trick. And he sees a lot of things happening naturally. And this is where he really drifts towards, that he says, okay, these universal patterns, these collective things, that's the reason that they're there. And one should conform to that. One cannot be completely separated from one's human nature and one's psychology. It's the same of like trying to get rid of one's organs. You can try, but you won't survive so long. So for him, natural things and things happening natural has a huge emphasis. This is also how he explains individuation. He does not give a manual how to individuate. He explains certain concepts, certain phenomena, but he says, just do the next logical thing. So it's not a planned out journey. It's again this pattern, but it will happen and reveal itself in a kind of natural way. And he focuses on that a lot, that he says, okay, human beings need to be connected to nature, not only externally, but also internally. He says, this is what culture does a lot, and our archetypes, that we need to connect to this natural, universal, old part of the psyche regularly, ideally in a controlled manner, to become a complete human being and to act in a really complete human way. So everything needs to be in concert. Everything needs to be running together, even though that it's disagreeable and fighting with each other. Basically, this is also how he describes the psyche, by things fighting against each other with consciousness and bringing order and structure and organizing that. And this is all due to how he sees the world. This is very much connected to a basic premise, just how he approaches everything. And this is that he first looks at the phenomenon and then tries to come up with a theory. This was a huge arguing point of his with Freud, because Freud, yes, he came up with an idea, with a model, with a concept, which is already pretty close to the psychological truth. Otherwise, we would not speak about Freud anymore. And Freud influenced a lot of things, and Freud was one of the most influential persons of the 20th century. There's no way arguing about it. Otherwise, we would not have coaching or psychotherapy and all these things. But at the same time, Freud stopped at a certain point and said, oh, I have my model. I can explain everything. I can reduce down this whole complexity of human behavior, for example, to the incest complex or the Oedipus complex or the mother complex or the father complex. And even religion is a father complex. Art, the reason why people are doing it, is a mother complex, and all these things. So he stopped at a certain point because he said, oh, I have a theory, I have a model, I know now everything. And now I just try to convince other people about it. But Jung never stopped. And this is the thing. He always took into account what he encountered and what just exists, and says, okay, there has to be a reason why this exists. So he first talks about the phenomena, and then he tries to have a kind of model or explanation for that. So it is in a sense systemless, but not really without logic. Everything, as I said, it is connected through really weird ways sometimes, why he's interested in certain things. And he continuously talks about it. But you can see through his development, because he started as a normal psychoanalyst, basically, and someone being interested in psychology, going up to the point where he says, oh, yeah, human beings' development is determined by changes in the collective unconscious that were mapped thousands of years ago into the sky in astrology. It's like, okay, yeah, there's a huge development from here to there, but it builds all logically, because every time he encounters something, he tries to incorporate it, because he sees again value everywhere. And he says, okay, if this is strange, then very likely it's because I do not understand it. He always took it very seriously, and he really tried to understand it, and he really tried to connect it and see there the psychological value. What does it tell about us, how we are, how we should live, how we should develop? And this is really what made him so hard to grasp, and which is why I can do these events already for a long time, because there are always topics of Jung where it's like, okay, yeah, he talks about National Socialism and then astrology, but then he talks about this one person that had a weird dream. So how is it all connected? It is connected, and he worked his whole life to connect those things. So he worked empirically, and this is something he emphasized a lot. When you read the letters of him, there's something he emphasizes a lot. He says, I'm a scientist. I do not come up with these things. It's just that I see them and I can't ignore them because they are there. I can't push them away and say, oh, there's a father complex. I do not need to deal with it and stay unconscious about it, but rather I need to engage. I need to transform. I need to connect it to the rest. And this is what makes him so interesting, because he talks a lot about a lot of things, and it all rings true because he had a whole life. He had his own whole life, and he had the life of all the people he had encountered and that he did therapy on. So this is why he hit certain universal themes and topics. This is why I can take a movie, for example, as Jaws or Barbie, and say, these are perfect examples to explain certain Jungian concepts. Because if you dig deep enough, you hit certain things that just pop up again and again. And it goes back to the idea of everything being connected. It is for him connected through our collective part and deep in our psyche, our human nature, that by necessity makes us similar to all the other human beings that existed before and that will exist. So these ideas and the phenomena, they will come up again and again and again, always in new forms, in new appearances, but the basic pattern again, and the background is the same, and it repeats and it repeats and it repeats. So the stuff that Jung saw 100 years ago, we still see it today, and we will also see it 100 years or 1,000 years again in the future, because as long as there are human beings around, there will be human psychology and there will be human nature. And this is really where the value of Jung lies, that he spent his whole life to see certain things. And this is what I wanted to talk about, like the things he saw and why he was interested in these things. So I hope that you got the basic ideas, the basic premises, that at a certain point that you go when you watch a movie or hear a story or hear a joke or something happens to you, that go like, oh yeah, this sounds something like Jung would be interested in. So I want to thank you for your attention, and yeah, thanks.
This was this event's topic. Thanks for tuning in. During an event, a discussion part follows after the presentation where all attendees discuss the just presented topic or other Jungian concepts. If you also want to join, find the group on meetup.com. The name of the group is CG Jung Helpdesk. Also make sure to subscribe to the podcast on the platform of your choice. See you next time.